We're now ready to go over the last section of our Chapter 9, where we've been studying the structure and the physiology of the skeletal muscles. The last thing we have to go through in our notes, if you will move with me towards the end, we can now go to slide 29. This is where we left off. This next slide discusses the differences in sizes of motor units. The motor unit is defined as the motor neuron. That's the nerve coming from the brain that's giving the muscle cell its signal, and all of the muscle fibers or muscle cells that are supplied by that motor unit. Sometimes this motor unit can be a very small unit in which you have very few number of fibers supplied by each nerve. This means that you can tell several different muscle fibers what to do simultaneously. We have small motor units in places such as our fingers. If you think about the intricate way you can move your fingers, you would understand that your brain has to be able to give signals to different muscles at different times. That way you can move your fingers in all different directions. If we then move to the opposite, the large motor unit, these are going to be muscles where you have a large number, sometimes up to several hundred muscle fibers supplied by a single motor neuron. These are going to be the type of muscles that do not make intricate movements. Instead, they're going to be muscles that are going to be weight-bearing muscles, such as the large muscle groups that make up our thighs and our hips. Those muscles are only responsible for moving our lower legs or our legs. If you think about it, your legs cannot move in as many ways as your fingers can, for example. Another term we have not covered yet in Chapter 9 is the term muscle tone. A lot of us use this term in everyday life. We will look at someone that exercises a lot and they look really fit, and we'll say that person's very toned. For someone to have muscle tone, that simply means that their muscles are staying in a slightly contracted state constantly. This happens in response to somebody that works those muscles very, very often. The reason your muscles become toned as you use them is because they become prepared for you to use them at any moment. If you think of it in a slightly silly way, let's say that I am the type of person that does crunches or ab work all the time. I'm probably going to have nicely toned ab muscles. Why do they need to be toned? Because those ab muscles have no idea when I'm going to call on them to do their next crunch. So they stay nice and firm and healthy, and they're just ready at any moment for me to need them. The major topic we have left to cover in Chapter 9 is to go over the sources of ATP that we have within our muscle cell. We have 3 different ways in which we can generate ATP. And if you recall from our last lecture, the availability of ATP is a crucial step in the ability for a muscle fiber to contract. Recall that as the myosin head reaches up and grabs the actin, the ATP is used as the myosin head completes the power stroke to move the actin molecules. In order to let go or detach from the actin, a new ATP molecule must come along and bind to the myosin head. Therefore, we need a constant supply of ATP in the muscle. The 3 ways we can generate ATP in our muscle are through use of creatine phosphate, anaerobic metabolism, and aerobic metabolism. If we first start with anaerobic metabolism, this is going to be a type of metabolism in which we are going to produce energy without the use of oxygen. Your muscles are actually one of the only cells in your body that can do this. Whenever your muscles have used all the available oxygen in the cell to do normal glucose metabolism, produce ATP the way you've always learned it, your muscle fibers have the ability of converting glucose into pyruvic acid and then converting pyruvic acid into lactic acid. This is not as energetically favorable as producing ATP the old-fashioned way, but this is a way for your muscles to function when they are lacking oxygen. The lactic acid that is produced inside of your muscles is actually what makes your muscles sore the next day after you have exercised. as you move around and use those muscles after they have become sore, eventually the lactic acid is going to diffuse out of your muscles, go into your bloodstream, and then we convert it back into pyruvic acid in the liver so that it can be further metabolized into either glucose or ATP, depending on where it's needed in the body. The aerobic pathway is the most common pathway and what produces most of our ATP when we are not really exercising very hard. The aerobic pathway works whenever we have oxygen present. So you should be able to kind of understand that we're going to have oxygen present when we are at rest or not exercising because we're not using the oxygen quite as fast. The aerobic pathway is the pathway you have learned about in all of your previous biology classes. In the aerobic pathway, you are going to start with glucose that is available in your bloodstream and muscles directly, or you're going to start with some glycogen, which is stored in your glycosomes within your muscle cells. The glycogen breaks down into glucose. Either of those methods, it doesn't matter, you end up with glucose. You'll then convert glucose into pyruvic acid through glycolysis. Then you enter the Krebs cycle, then to the electron transport chain, where you make energy with the presence of oxygen. The third pathway for producing energy is by using a molecule called creatine phosphate. If you recall, the most basic way to make ATP is through substrate level phosphorylation. That is where you take a molecule of ADP and you add a phosphate to it, producing ATP. Creatine phosphate is a molecule that hangs around in your muscle fibers so that you can store up phosphate. Therefore, anytime you have an ADP, it can then come pick up a phosphate from creatine phosphate, producing ATP upon demand. This is going to be your least useful method of producing ATP. As a review, when you are at rest and you have plenty of oxygen available, your muscles do aerobic metabolism. Once you start exercising very hard and you use all of the oxygen that is available, your muscles will then switch into anaerobic metabolism, in which they produce lactic acid because there's no oxygen available. As a last resource, some of the molecules of ADP will pick up a phosphate from a creatine phosphate molecule and make some ATP.